What exactly was said between Todd Blanche and Ghislaine Maxwell that led her to be transferred to a minimum security prison? What we did get was another episode in her long-running campaign for clemency from President Trump. And President Trump could end that today. He could rule out clemency for Ghislaine Maxwell, the monster. He could rule out a pardon for Ghislaine Maxwell, the monster. The question for all of us today is, why hasn't he done that, and why won't he do that?
Ghislaine Maxwell, convicted in the Epstein network and now serving a 20-year sentence, refused to answer questions before the U.S. House Oversight Committee this week, invoking her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Maxwell's lawyer publicly stated she would only cooperate if former President Donald Trump granted her clemency, including testifying that Trump and others are innocent of any wrongdoing. Across Capitol Hill, lawmakers have responded with bipartisan frustration, arguing that her silence only deepens political and legal pressure around the broader Epstein record releases. On Monday, Ghislaine Maxwell appeared virtually before the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, which is investigating aspects of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal and related documentation. Instead of answering questions about co-conspirators or the sprawling network of abuses tied to Epstein's trafficking enterprise, Maxwell invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and refused to testify. This decision echoed what her counsel had signaled in letters to lawmakers, that she would not respond to committee questioning unless issues around ongoing appeals and legal exposure were addressed. According to public reporting, Maxwell is serving a 2-decade sentence for sex trafficking and related offenses, and she is actively seeking to have her conviction reviewed. Her choice to remain silent in the congressional deposition undercuts the committee's attempt to place a live human narrative behind the volumes of documents federal authorities have released. For Donald Trump, who signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act last year, a law requiring the Justice Department to release unclassified Epstein-related documents, Maxwell's silence represented a political obstacle. Trump's posture in recent months has been reactive, approving the law's passage under pressure from lawmakers and legal advocates rather than leading on transparency himself. Institutional resistance from committee investigators, the public demand for accountability, and victims' advocates has constrained Trump's ability to manage the narrative here. Maxwell's silence is not the end of the story. In fact, it has amplified calls for public access to the files she might otherwise explain. Pressure is now visibly shifting away from containment and toward escalation. Within hours of Maxwell's closed-door deposition, her attorney made a consequential statement to lawmakers and reporters. Maxwell would be willing to testify fully in the Epstein probe if President Donald Trump grants her clemency. This was not a private legal gambit. It was broadcast publicly, starkly framing Maxwell's cooperation as conditional on an act of presidential mercy. According to reporting, Maxwell's lawyer specifically suggested she could speak fully and honestly about Epstein's operations and related inquiries if given clemency, including statements that would clear both Trump and former President Bill Clinton of wrongdoing. Importantly, these comments do not reflect actual evidence implicating Trump, and reporters have emphasized that no credible accusations of criminal conduct by Trump have been substantiated. What Maxwell's lawyer offered was a conditional promise, dependent on executive action that carries its own constitutional and political consequences. Trump's own position here has been reactive. Public records from late 2025 show that Trump signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act into law after bipartisan congressional pressure, despite previous resistance from some in his party. But whether to grant clemency to Maxwell remains unresolved. Trump has not publicly committed to such a move, and senior Republicans expressed swift backlash after the attorney's comments. This dynamic reveals a clear miscalculation. By allowing Maxwell's conditional statements to enter the public domain without an accompanying executive response, Trump has enabled lawmakers and media to frame the situation as a clemency dilemma rather than one of institutional control. Instead of shaping the narrative, the administration now faces escalating questions about potential leniency and its implications. Lawmakers from both parties condemned the notion of a clemency exchange, underscoring the political risk and the legal constraints around granting pardons to a convicted trafficker. Rather than diffusing the situation, Maxwell's conditional offer has intensified scrutiny and limited Trump's strategic space, making every rhetorical and legal move more consequential. What was once an investigative deposition has become a political clock ticking relentlessly toward further institutional pressure. The core of the current crisis lies not in a simple choice between cooperation and silence. It is an institutional trap that increasingly constrains Donald Trump's leverage. When Maxwell invoked her Fifth Amendment right before Congress, she exercised a constitutional protection designed to prevent self-incrimination in legal proceedings. Yet by publicly linking her potential cooperation to presidential clemency, her legal team shifted the issue into a political arena where executive, legislative, and public forces collide. Trump's posture here has been reactive, not proactive. He signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act after lawmakers overwhelmingly approved it, effectively ceding control of the document release process to congressional oversight. Maxwell's silence now highlights that the legislative branch, not the presidency, is leading the unraveling of the Epstein archive. The law itself has compelled the Justice Department to make millions of pages of related files available to lawmakers, a process that has generated intense political debate and calls for full disclosure. This is a critical blind spot. Trump's strategy appears to have hinged on the idea that releasing files would dissipate public and political pressure. Instead, the files have increased scrutiny, and Maxwell's public offer to tie cooperation to clemency has shifted the focus to the executive's discretion over mercy, a domain fraught with legal precedent and political peril. Consider the institutional constraints entangling Trump. Granting clemency to a convicted sex trafficker would trigger widespread condemnation from both parties, potentially alienate key constituencies, and raise questions about motive and fairness. Maxwell's attorney's comments make this clear. The offer is framed as a truth exchange, not a legal obligation. Yet that framing places Trump in a position where inaction is itself interpreted as a political decision. Conversely, acting on clemency would signal a break with bipartisan sentiment and embolden critics who argue that powerful figures are treated differently. Lawmakers who have been pushing for transparency in the Epstein files view such a pardon as an affront to accountability. Moreover, the public perception of backroom deals, even without substantiated evidence of wrongdoing by Trump, further diminishes the presidency's credibility in the Epstein matter. The institutional trap tightens when each branch asserts its own agenda. Congress demands transparency and testimony. The Justice Department complies with legal requirements for file release, and the presidency grapples with constitutional authority and political optics. Maxwell stands at the intersection of these forces, but not as an agent of clarity, rather, as a catalyst that exposes the limits of presidential influence. Maxwell's conditional offer also amplifies tension around released findings. A massive tranche of documents has been made public as part of the compliance process with the Epstein Files Transparency Act, revealing limited direct legal ties to Trump but extensive references to Epstein's network. The existence of these files and the political battles around their release underscores that transparency is not a singular event but an ongoing institutional process. In this environment, Trump cannot simply assert authority and expect unified deference. The decision to sign the Transparency Act was itself a concession. His next move, whether to engage with Maxwell's conditional proposition, must contend with widespread institutional skepticism and public pressure. The pressure points multiplying around Trump include: first, legislative demands for fuller disclosure and testimony, with Congress asserting oversight. Second, public scrutiny of executive discretion over clemency, a realm where past precedents complicate optics. Third, media narratives framing silence and conditional offers as political leverage, not lawful cooperation. Ultimately, the institutional trap highlights that Trump's remaining options are not expansive, they are narrowing. Each choice risks deeper entanglement with the political and legal ramifications of the Epstein saga rather than resolution. Instead of directing events, Trump now navigates within parameters increasingly set by others. And with every document released and every public repudiation of conditional cooperation, the presidency's leverage weakens further. As Maxwell's refusal and conditional offer reverberated through Washington, the fallout exposed a second failure: the inability to contain the story within manageable institutional lanes. According to public reporting, Members of Congress from both parties expressed frustration that the deposition produced no substantive testimony while simultaneously injecting the presidency into the center of the controversy. Lawmakers emphasized that invoking the Fifth Amendment was legally permissible, but argued that the broader Epstein inquiry could not stall indefinitely behind procedural silence. For Donald Trump, this moment underscored a recurring pattern. His decision to sign the Epstein Files Transparency Act was framed as compliance with legislative will rather than leadership. Once the law took effect, control over the pace and scope of disclosures shifted decisively toward Congress and the Justice Department. That transfer of authority limited Trump's ability to shape outcomes, leaving him exposed to consequences he could no longer calibrate. Institutional resistance hardened quickly. Committee leaders reiterated that document releases would continue regardless of Maxwell's cooperation. According to statements from lawmakers, subpoenas and further hearings remain options if gaps persist. The Justice Department, bound by the statute, continued processing and releasing Epstein-related materials, reinforcing the perception that the executive branch was executing orders rather than directing strategy. The containment problem deepened in public discourse. Media coverage increasingly framed the issue not as a discrete legal matter, but as a test of presidential judgment. Even without substantiated allegations against Trump, the optics of a convicted trafficker offering cooperation only in exchange for clemency proved politically corrosive. The narrative shifted from transparency to trust and from procedure to power. This dynamic illustrates a miscalculation. Silence was assumed to dampen attention. Instead, it extended the life of the controversy. Each refusal to testify prompted renewed debate about accountability. Each document release invited new scrutiny. The story did not close. It metastasized across committees, agencies, and media cycles. By this stage, Trump's posture appeared constrained by forces outside his control. Congress-controlled oversight, statute-controlled disclosure, public expectation controlled the political cost of inaction. Attempts to distance himself from the Epstein files collided with the reality that his signature on the law made him structurally relevant to every subsequent development. Containment failed because the issue was no longer containable. It had become an institutional process with momentum of its own, indifferent to presidential preference. And once a process reaches that stage, delay no longer preserves leverage, it accelerates its erosion. At this point, Donald Trump's remaining options are limited and sharply defined. According to public reporting, he has not indicated any intention to grant clemency to Ghislaine Maxwell. Maintaining that position avoids immediate backlash, but it also guarantees continued silence from a central figure and sustains congressional pressure. Inaction preserves legal distance, yet it forfeits narrative control. The alternative executive clemency carries its own constraints. Granting mercy to a convicted sex trafficker would provoke bipartisan condemnation, intensify scrutiny of motive, and undermine claims of impartial governance. Even absent evidence implicating Trump, such an act would reframe the Epstein saga as a story of unequal treatment, eroding institutional credibility. The Constitution grants the power, but politics imposes the cost. There is no third path that restores authority without consequence. Congress will continue oversight under the Transparency Act. The Justice Department will continue disclosures according to statutory requirements. Media attention will persist as long as documents emerge and testimony remains absent. These outcomes follow mechanically from decisions already made. This is the core lesson of the episode. Trump entered the Epstein file debate, assuming that formal compliance would neutralize risk. Instead, compliance shifted control outward. What remains is a presidency reacting to processes it no longer commands, constrained by law, institutions, and public expectation. The significance lies not in what Maxwell said she said nothing, but in what her silence revealed. It exposed the limits of executive leverage once transparency mechanisms are activated and oversight is engaged. It demonstrated that power, when deferred, does not pause. It redistributes. Trump's choices now operate within a narrow corridor. Each step carries a cost. Each delay compounds scrutiny. The outcome remains uncertain, but the trajectory is clear. Leverage is diminishing, not consolidating. This is not a question of innocence or guilt. It is a case study in institutional gravity and in how quickly it pulls authority out of any single actor's hands.